Now for Chapter 4. It was only on reaching home, as I walked from the garage to the house, that I read the inscription on the envelope. To whom it may concern, probably Commissary Shiraz. Having told the servants that I would have only a light supper to be served immediately in my study, and that I was not to be disturbed after, I ran upstairs, threw Helene's envelope on my desk, and made another careful search of the room before closing the shutters and drawing the curtains. All I could find was a long since dead mosquito stuck to the wall near the ceiling. Having motioned to the servant to put her tray down on a table by the fireplace, I poured myself a glass of wine and locked the door behind her. I then disconnected the telephone, I always did this now at night, and turned out all the lights but the lamp on my desk. Slitting open Helene's fat envelope, I extracted a thick wad of closely written pages. I read the following lines neatly centered in the middle of the top page. This is not a confession because, although I killed my husband, I am not a murderess. I simply and very faithfully carried out his last wish by crushing his head and right arm under the steam hammer of his brother's factory. Without even touching the glass of wine by my elbow, I turned the page and started reading. For very nearly a year before his death, the manuscript began. My husband had told me of some of his experiments. He knew full well that his colleagues of the Air Ministry would have forbidden some of them as too dangerous, but he was keen on obtaining positive results before reporting his discovery. Whereas only sound and pictures had been so far transmitted through space by radio and television, Andre claimed to have discovered a way of transmitting matter. Matter, any solid object placed in his transmitter, was instantly disintegrated and reintegrated in a special receiving set. Andre considered his discovery as perhaps the most important since that of the wheel sawn off the end of a tree trunk. He reckoned that the transmission of matter by instantaneous disintegration-reintegration would completely change life as we had known it so far. It would mean the end of all means of transport, not only of goods, including food, but also of human beings. Andre, the practical scientist who never allowed theories or daydreams to get the better of him, already foresaw the time when there would be no longer be any airplanes, ships, trains, or cars, and therefore no longer any roads or railway lines, ports, airports, or stations. All that would be replaced by matter transmitting and receiving stations throughout the world. Travelers and goods would be placed in special cabins, and at a given signal would simply disappear and reappear almost immediately at the chosen receiving station. Andre's receiving set was only a few feet away from his transmitter, in an adjoining room of his laboratory, and he at first ran into all sorts of snags. His first successful experiment was carried out with an ashtray taken from his desk, a souvenir we had brought back from a trip to London. That was the first time he told me about his experiments, and I had no idea what he was talking about the day he came dashing into the house and threw the ashtray in my lap. "Helene, look! For a fraction of a second, a bare 10 millionth of a second, that ashtray had been completely disintegrated. For one little moment, it no longer existed. Gone! Nothing left. Absolutely nothing. only atoms traveling through space at the speed of light, and the moment after, the atoms were once more gathered together in the shape of an ashtray. Andre, please, please, what on earth are you raving about? He started sketching all over a letter I had been writing. He laughed at my wry face, swept all my letters off the table, and said, "You don't understand. Right. Let's start off all over again. Helene, do you remember I once read you an article about the mysterious flying stones that seem to come through nowhere in particular, and which are said to occasionally fall in certain houses in India? They come flying in as though thrown from outside, and that, in spite of closed doors and windows." "Yes, I remember. I also remember that Professor Augier, your friend of the College de France, who had come down for a few days, remarked that if there was no trickery about it, the only possible explanation was that the stones had been disintegrated after having been thrown from outside, come through the walls, and then been reintegrated before hitting the floor or the opposite walls." "That's right, and I added that there was of course one other possibility, namely the momentary and partial disintegration of the walls as the stone or stones came through." "Yes, Andre, I remember all that, and I suppose you also remember that I failed to understand and that you got quite annoyed. Well, I still do not understand why and how even disintegrated stones should be able to come through a wall or closed door. But it is possible, Helene, because the atoms that go to make up matter are not close together like the bricks of a wall. They are separated by relative immensities of space." "Do you mean to say that you have disintegrated that ashtray and then put it together again after pushing it through something?" "Precisely, Helene. I project it through the wall that separates my transmitter from my receiving set." "And would it be foolish to ask how humanity is to benefit from ashtrays that can go through walls?" Andre seemed quite offended, but he soon saw that I was only teasing, and again waxing enthusiastic. He told me of some of the possibilities of his discovery. "Isn't it wonderful, Helene?" he finally gasped out of breath. "Yes, Andre, but I hope you won't ever transmit me. I'd be too much afraid of coming out at the other end like your ashtray." "What do you mean? Do you remember what was written under that ashtray?" "Yes, of course. Made in Japan. That was the great joke of our typically British souvenir. The words are still there, Andre, but look!" He took the ashtray out of my hands, frowned, and walked over to the window. Then he went quite pale, and I knew that he had seen what had proved to me that he had indeed carried out a strange experiment. The 3 words were still there, but reversed and reading, "Nap ja ni idam." Without a word, having completely forgotten me, Andre rushed off to his laboratory. I only saw him the next morning, tired and unshaven after a whole night's work. A few days later, Andre had a new reverse, which put him out of the sorts and made him fussy and grumpy for several weeks. I stood it patiently enough for a while, but being myself bad-tempered one evening, we had a silly row over some futile thing, and I reproached him for his moroseness. "I'm sorry, Cherie. I've been working my way through a maze of problems, and had given you all a very rough time. You see, my very first experiment with a live animal proved a complete fiasco." "Andre, you tried that experiment with Dandolo, didn't you?" "Yes, how did you know?" he answered sheepishly. He disintegrated perfectly but never reappeared in the receiving set. Oh, Andre! What became of him then? Nothing. There is just no more Dandolo. Only the dispersed atoms of a cat wandering, God knows where in the universe. Dandolo was a small white cat the cook had found one morning in the garden and which we had promptly adopted. Now I knew how it disappeared and was quite angry about the whole thing, but my husband was so miserable over it all that I said nothing. I saw little of my husband during the next few weeks. He had most of his meals sent down to the laboratory. I would often wake up in the morning and find his bed unslept in. Sometimes, if he had come in very late, I would find that the storm-swept appearance which only a man can give a bedroom by getting up very early and fumbling around in the dark. One evening he came home to dinner all smiles, and I knew that his troubles were over. His face dropped, however, when he saw I was dressed for going out. "Oh, were you going out, Helene?" "Yes, the Drillins invited me for a game of bridge, but I can easily phone them and put it off." "No, it's all right." "It isn't all right. Out with it, dear." "Well, I've at last got everything perfect and wanted you to be the first to see the miracle." "Magnifique, Andre! Of course, I'll be delighted." Having telephoned our neighbors to say how sorry I was and so forth, I ran down to the kitchen and told the cook that she had exactly 10 minutes in which to prepare a celebration dinner. "An excellent idea, Helene," said my husband, when the maid appeared with the champagne after our candlelight dinner. "We'll celebrate with reintegrated champagne," and taking the tray from the maid's hands, he led the way down to the laboratory. "Do you think it will be as good as before its disintegration?" I asked, holding the tray while he opened the door and switched on the lights. "Have no fear, you'll see. Just bring it here, will you?" he said, opening the door of a telephone call box he had and which had been transformed into what he called a transmitter. "Put it down on that now," he added, putting a stool inside the box. Having carefully closed the door, he took me to the other end of the room and handed me a pair of very dark sunglasses. He put on another pair and walked back to a switchboard by the transmitter. "Ready, Helene?" said my husband, turning out all the lights. "Don't remove your glasses till I give the word." "I won't budge, Andre. Go on," I told him, my eyes fixed on the tray which I could just see in a greenish shimmering light through the glass-paneled door of the telephone booth. "Right," said Andre, throwing a switch. The whole room was brilliantly illuminated by an orange flash. Inside the cabin, I had seen a crackling ball of fire and felt its heat on my face, neck, and hands. The whole thing lasted but the fraction of a second, and I found myself blinking at green-edged black holes like those one sees after having stared at the sun. "Et Viola, you can take off your glasses, Helene." A little theatrically, perhaps, my husband opened the door of the cabin. Though Andre had told me what to expect, I was astonished to find that the champagne glasses, tray, and stool were no longer there. Andre sermoniously led me by the hand into the next room, in a corner of which stood a second telephone booth. Opening the door wide, he triumphantly lifted the champagne tray off the stool. Feeling somewhat like the good-natured kind member of the audience that has been dragged onto music hall stage by the magician. I repressed from saying, all done with the mirrors, which I knew would have annoyed my husband. Sure it's not dangerous to drink? I asked as the cork popped. Absolutely sure, Helene, he said, handing me a glass, but that was nothing. Drink this off and I'll show you something much more astounding. We went back into the other room. Oh, Andre, remember, poor Dandolo. This is only a guinea pig, Helene, but I'm positive it will go through all right. He set the furry little beast down on the green, enabled floor of the booth and quickly closed the door. I again put on my dark glasses and saw and felt the vivid crackling flash. Without waiting for Andre to open the door, I rushed into the next room, where the lights were still on, and looked into the receiving booth. "Oh, Andre, chérie, he's there all right," I shouted excitedly, watching the little animal trotting round and round. "It's wonderful, Andre, it works. You've succeeded." "I hope so, but I must be patient. I'll know for sure in a few weeks' time." "What do you mean? Look, he's as full of life as when you put him in the other cabin." "Yes, so he seems, but we'll have to wait to see if all his organs are intact. And that will take some time. If that little beast is still full of life in a month's time, we then consider the experiment a success." I begged Andre to let me take care of the guinea pig. "All right, but don't kill it by overfeeding," he agreed with a grin for my enthusiasm. Though not allowed to take Hop-la, the name I had given the guinea pig, out of its box in the laboratory, I had tied a pink ribbon round its neck and was allowed to feed it twice a day. Hop-la soon got used to its pink ribbon and became quite a tame little pet. But that month of waiting seemed a year. And then one day, Andre put Maquette, our cocker spaniel, into his transmitter. He had not told me beforehand, knowing full well that I would never have agreed to such an experiment with our dog. But when he did tell me, Maquette had been successfully transmitted half a dozen times and seemed to be enjoying the operation thoroughly. No sooner was she let out of the reintegrator than she dashed madly into the next room, scratching at the transmitter door to have another go, as Andre called it. I now expected that my husband would invite some of his colleagues and air ministry specialists to come down. He usually did this when he had finished a research job, and before handing them long detailed reports, which he always typed himself, he would carry out an experiment or two before them. But this time, he just went on working. One morning, I finally asked him when he intended throwing his usual surprise party, as we called it. "No, Helene, not for a long while yet. This discovery is much too important. I have an awful lot of work to do on it still. Do you realize that there are some parts of the transmission proper which I do not yet myself fully understand? It works all right, but you see, I can't just say to all these eminent professors that I do this and that, and proof it works. I must be able to explain how and why it works, and what is even more important, I must be ready and able to refute every destructive argument that will not fail to trot out, as they usually do when faced with anything really good." I was occasionally invited down to the laboratory to witness some new experiment, but I never went unless Andre invited me, and only talked about his work if he broached the subject first. Of course, it never occurred to me that he would, at that stage at least, have tried an experiment with a human being, though had I thought about it, knowing Andre, it would have been obvious that he would never have allowed anyone into the transmitter before he had been through to test it first. It was only after the accident that I discovered he had duplicated all his switches inside the disintegration booth so that he could try it out by himself. The morning Andre tried his terrible experiment, he did not show up for lunch. I sent the maid down with the tray, but she brought it back with a note she had found pinned outside the laboratory door. "Do not disturb me, I am working." He did occasionally pin such notes on his door, and though I noticed, I paid no particular attention to the unusually large handwriting of his note. It was just after that, as I was drinking my coffee, that Henry came bouncing into the room to say that he had caught a funny fly, and would I like to see it? Refusing even to look at his closed fist, I ordered him to release it immediately. "But, Mommy, it has such a funny white head." Marching the boy over to the open window, I told him to release the fly immediately, which he did. I knew that Henry had caught the fly merely because he thought it looked curious or different from other flies, but I also knew that his father would never stand for any form of cruelty to animals, and that there would be a fuss should he discover that our son had put a fly in a box or a bottle. At dinner time that evening, Andre had still not shown up, and a little worried, I ran down to the laboratory and knocked at the door. He did not answer my knock, but I heard him moving around, and a moment later he slipped a note under the door. It was typewritten. "Helene, I am having trouble. Put the boy to bed and come back in an hour's time. A." Frightened, I knocked and called, but Andre did not seem to pay any attention, and vaguely reassured by the familiar noise of his typewriter, I went back to the house. Having put Henry to bed, I returned to the laboratory, where I found another note slipped under the door. My hand shook as I picked it up because I knew by then something must be radically wrong. I read, "Helene, first of all, I count on you not to lose your nerve or do anything rash because you alone can help me. I have had a serious accident. I am not in any particular danger for the time being, though it is a matter of life and death. It is useless calling to me or saying anything. I cannot answer. I cannot speak. I want you to do exactly and very carefully all that I ask. After having knocked 3 times to show that you understand and agree, fetch me a bowl of milk laced with rum. I have had nothing all day and cannot do without it." Shaking with fear, not knowing what to think, and repressing a furious desire to call Andre and bang away until he opened, I knocked 3 times as requested, and ran all the way home to fetch what he wanted. In less than 5 minutes I was back. Another note had been slipped under the door. "Helene, follow these instructions carefully. When you knock, I'll open the door. You are to walk over to my desk and put down the bowl of milk. You will then go into the other room where the receiver is. Look carefully and try to find a fly, which ought to be there, but which I am unable to find. Unfortunately, I cannot see small things very easily. Before you come in, you must promise to obey me implicitly. Do not look at me, and remember that talking is quite useless. I cannot answer. Knock again 3 times, and that will mean I have your promise. My life depends entirely on the help you can give me." I had to wait a while to pull myself together, and then I knocked slowly 3 times. I heard Andre shuffling behind the door, then his fumbling with the lock, and the door opened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw that he was standing behind the door, but without looking round, I carried the bowl of milk to his desk. He was evidently watching me, and I must at all costs appear calm and collected. "Sherry, you can count on me," I said gently, and putting the bowl down under his desk lamp, the only one all right. I walked into the next room, where all the lights were blazing. My first impression was that some sort of hurricane must have blown out of the receiving booth. Papers were scattered in every direction. A whole row of test tubes laid smash in a corner. Chairs and stools were upset, and one of the window curtains hung half torn from its bent rod. In a large enamel basin on the floor, a heap of burned documents was still smoldering. I knew that I would not find the fly Andre wanted me to look for. Women know things that men only suppose by reasoning and deduction. It is a form of knowledge very rarely accessible to them, and which they despairingly call intuition. I already knew that the fly Andre wanted was the one which Henry had caught, and which I had made him release. I heard Andre shuffling around in the next room, and then a strange gurgling and sucking as though he had trouble in drinking his milk. "Andre, there is no fly here. Can you give me any sort of indication that might help? If you can't speak, rap or something, you know? Once for yes, twice for no." I had tried to control my voice and speak as though perfectly calm, but I had to choke down a sob of desperation when he rapped twice for no. "May I come to you, Andre? I don't know what can have happened, but whatever it is, I'll be courageous, dear. After a moment of silent hesitation, he tapped once on his desk. At the door, I stopped aghast at the sight of Andre standing with his head and shoulders covered by the brown velvet cloth he had taken from a table by his desk, the table on which he usually ate when he did not want to leave his work, suppressing a laugh that might easily have turned to sobbing. I said, "Andre, we'll search thoroughly tomorrow by daylight. Why don't you go to bed? I'll lead you to the guest room if you like, and won't let anyone else see you." His left hand tapped the desk twice. "Do you need a doctor, Andre?" "No," he rapped. "Would you like me to call up Professor Angier? He might be of more help." Twice he rapped no sharply. I did not know what to do or say, and then I told him. "Henry caught a fly this morning which he wanted to show me, but I made him release it. Could it have been the one you were looking for? I didn't see it, but the boy said its head was white." Andre emitted a strange metallic sigh, and I just had time to bite my fingers fiercely in order not to scream. He had let his right arm drop, and instead of his long-fingered muscular hand, a gray stick with little buds on it like the branch of a tree hung out of his sleeve almost down to his knee. Whew. "Andre, Mom Cherie, tell me what happened. I might be of more help to you if I knew. Andre, oh, it's terrible!" I sobbed, unable to control myself. Having rapped once for yes, he pointed to the door with his left hand. I stepped out and sank down crying. As he locked the door behind me, he was typing again, and I waited. At last, he shuffled to the door and slid a sheet of paper under it. Helene, come back in the morning. I must think and will have typed out an explanation for you. Take one of my sleeping tablets and go straight to bed. I need you fresh and strong tomorrow, my pauvre chérie. Do you want anything for the night, Andre? I shouted through the door. He knocked twice for no, and a little later I heard the typewriter again. The sun full on my face woke up with a start. I had set the alarm clock for 5, but had not heard it, probably because of the sleeping tablets. I had indeed slept like a log, without a dream. Now I was back in my living nightmare, and crying like a child, I sprang out of bed. It was just on 7. Rushing into the kitchen without a word for the startled servants, I rapidly prepare a trade load of coffee, bread, and butter, with which I ran down to the laboratory. Andre opened the door as soon as I knocked, and closed it again as I carried the tray to his desk. His head was still covered, but I saw from his crumpled suit and his open camp bed that he must have at least tried to rest. On his desk lay a typewritten sheet for me which I picked up. Andre opened the other door, and taking this to mean that he wanted me to be left alone, I walked into the next room. He pushed the door to, and I heard him pouring out the coffee as I read.